In this episode, I'm talking about the relationship between the brain, the nervous system, and behavior. And what I want to do is I want to summarize a couple of the key points and key aspects of the nervous system that I think you need to know that'll be very beneficial when it comes to understanding human behavior and the brain. Welcome back to another episode of Holistic Lifestyle Coaching with Ryan David. I'm Ryan David, aka Mr. AB. Today I'm putting on my professor hat and I'm teaching a lesson in psychology related to the brain and the nervous system. When we talk about psychology and what we're interested in when it comes to psychology, most people that are interested in psychology are interested in the mind aspect of psychology. Thoughts, beliefs, emotions, those sort of things. And so to talk about the brain can be somewhat tedious. It can kind of be very technical and somewhat, talking about biology and the anatomy and parts and structures. And you might seem like, well, that's overwhelming, or I don't want to know that, or that's not interesting. But I want to try to shift your thinking on that a little bit. And the way I want you to shift your thinking is this. Understand, if you're interested in the mind is what the brain does. That's a scientific consensus at this point. And that's actually was a debate for a long time when talking about the brain and the mind. There was a debate called dualism. You can look it up. And really the debate was whether or not the brain and the mind were two separate things. The scientific consensus now is that our mind, the part that most of us are interested in, really is an extension of our brains and what our brain does. So saying all that to tell you this, if you're interested in the mind, if you're interested in psychology and behavior, thoughts, feelings, emotions, beliefs, all those things, then get interested in the brain, because that's where it all starts and that's where it all comes from. By the way, I'm talking about the brain today. Do you guys appreciate the fact that I'm talking about gray matter and I put on a gray shirt? I don't know if you guys appreciate the style or the fashion and thought process that goes into these videos. But anyway, gray matter, gray shirt, patting myself on the back. Let's just jump in real quick to the lesson itself, starting with the nervous system. The brain is a part of the nervous system. It's a part of the central nervous system. We know that already. The brain and the spinal cord are the central nervous system. Those two parts make up the central nervous system. But that's just one branch, the central nervous system. The nervous system also has a peripheral branch too, and the peripheral branch is broken down into, or I should say, a peripheral nervous system. It's broken down into two branches. And the peripheral nervous system serves a purpose of bringing information to and from the central nervous system so your brain can really interact with the world. So that's what I want to distinguish today. I want to try to make that as simple as I can so you understand how the nervous system works, and then you can understand maybe how and why everything else that goes on in our lives really relates back to us and our being and our physical body. So the nervous system itself, the two branches, central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system, like I say, it consists of the brain and the spinal cord. I'm not going to get into parts of the brain per se or the spinal cord. So I'm not going to necessarily talk about the central nervous system itself, but I'll talk about its relationship to the peripheral nervous system and break the peripheral nervous system down and how it operates as far as the relationship with the central nervous system. I think if I say these terms enough, the repetition of them will help you understand it. So let's focus on the nervous system, specifically the peripheral nervous system, which has two branches. What are those two branches? Like I said, well, let's take a look at the diagram here. We can look at figure one, and we can see in figure one, we can see the breakdown of the nervous system here, and it gives you a good idea. You see the nervous system there, central nervous system on one side, and then the peripheral nervous system. It says like it's a whole separate a whole separate system, and it kind of is. It's the peripheral system that works to bring information to and from the brain. So let's just look at that peripheral system and see how that works and how it breaks down into two different branches to gather information and send information, so on and so forth, to the brain. We'll focus on the peripheral nervous system initially here. So if we look at the peripheral nervous system, we see that it breaks down into two separate branches. And let's look at those two branches individually right now first. So the first branch of the peripheral nervous system is the somatic nervous system. And the somatic nervous system really deals with nerves, two sets of nerves. The two sets of nerves, as you can see here in the diagram, two sets of nerves are sensory nerves and motor nerves. So I came across a nice acronym that helps you understand or remember the relationship between sensory nerves and motor nerves. But first, let me just break those two things down. Sensory nerves, the question is, what do they do? What do sensory nerves do? Well, they're involved in exactly what they sound like, senses, sensation. And so when you experience a sensation, are you receiving information or are you sending information? Well, sensory experience is where you're receiving information. So sensory nerves are obviously bringing information into the body, to the nervous system, to the spinal cord, to the brain. So sensory nerves are involved with receiving information. Okay? And I'll talk about specifically afferent nerves in a minute. But understand, the sensory branch of the somatic nervous system. The sensory branch is involved with the sensory nerves involved with receiving information. Those are the nerves that are involved with receiving information from our environment. Okay. The other branch is the motor nerves. And motor nerves, what are they involved with? Well, motor coordination. If you're going to move your arm, you have to send a signal to your arm from your brain to move it, right? So motor nerves cause you to be able to move and different physical functions, those sort of things. So motor nerves are messages that are sent, nerves that carry messages from the brain to the rest of the body, opposite of sensory nerves. So the acronym SAME is a way to remember sensory nerves are afferent nerves and motor nerves are efferent nerves. And I'll get into those two terms now because those are the two words or the terminology we use as far as the nerves. Sensory nerves do bring information to the body and motor nerves do carry information from the brain to the body. But the way to understand what I'm about to say is to understand, first let me make the point of the difference between nerves and neurons. I'm going to talk about neurons here in a bit when we talk about neurotransmitters, chemical messengers, and synaptic transmission real quick, and I'll get into that. But I want to break down what is a nerve, what is a neuron? Well, a nerve is simply a bundle of neurons. So a neuron is a nerve cell, if you can think of it like that. So we have nerves really just are bundles of neurons. So when we talk about motor nerves, what we're talking about is a bundle of efferent neurons. So back to my acronym, SAME. Sensory nerves are afferent neurons, SA, and motor nerves are efferent neurons. So SA, sensory, afferent, motor, ME, motor, efferent. So that word SAME is one way to remember the difference between the two types of nerves, but also and what they do as far as that branch of our nervous system, the somatic branch of our nervous system, somatic nervous system. Those two types of nerves, but it's also a way to distinguish between the two. Another way is I think of afferent, you can call them afferent nerves, afferent neurons, the ones that receive sensation. Afferent starts with an A, and so does absorb, so you absorb information from your environment. So whatever mnemonic you got to use to try and remember and associate and understand that, feel free to go ahead and do it. But that word SAME was pretty cool. It helped me understand really the somatic nervous system. And there's a way to remember the somatic nervous system. Starts with S and then SAME. Those are the two nerves. Somatic. So the somatic branch of the nervous system is one part of the peripheral. Okay? And the somatic branch of the nervous system is involved with just sensory nerves and motor nerves. The other part of the peripheral nervous system is what I want to get to now, which is called the autonomic nervous system. And looking back at the figure here, we can see that the autonomic nervous system is broken down into two branches itself. The autonomic nervous system is broken down into two branches that are involved with and regulate arousal and calming in the body. And we have so much of our body that's involved with this process of stimulation and then calming back down. And everything works this way, from everything that affects your sleep cycle to your heart rate to your blood sugar. All of it has a homeostasis, a level of balance where it's supposed to be. And sometimes it gets elevated and your body has to bring it back down. Sometimes it gets too low and your body has to bring it back up. That's your peripheral, that's your autonomic nervous system. That's the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of your nervous system working in tandem, kind of like a seesaw. Autonomic branch, as diagram shows, is broken down to the parasympathetic and the sympathetic branches of the nervous system. So if we look at what those two things do, the sympathetic branch first, the sympathetic part of your autonomic nervous system. The sympathetic branch is involved with arousal. And the way I remember the sympathetic from the parasympathetic, because they sound so familiar, the sympathetic, and you can write this in your notes or kind of go over this one, but the sympathetic nervous system is really your stress response. It's the branch of your nervous system that's involved in initiating your fight or flight response. So the sympathetic branch of your nervous system is involved with arousal. It's your stress response. How do we remember that one? Well, sympathetic, don't think sympathy, even though I just plugged that seed in your mind now and you're not gonna be able to get rid of it. Has nothing to do with that. What I want you to do instead is focus on the first letter of sympathetic, S, right? The sympathetic branch of your nervous system initiates the stress response. Stress, sympathetic, stress, sympathetic, stress, sympathetic. Make that association, because the sympathetic branch of your nervous system is involved with initiating the stress response or the fight or flight response or the fear response. They're all the same thing, by the way. That's the branch that's involved with arousal, okay, the sympathetic branch. The other half of that autonomic nervous system is the parasympathetic. And the way I remember that is because when you get paralyzed, do you move a lot? Is there a whole lot of arousal going on? No, not at all. So when you're paralyzed, there's not a lot of arousal. You're pretty calm when that happens. Hope it doesn't. But the parasympathetic branch of the nervous system is the branch that's involved with calming you down. So parasympathetic, calming, sympathetic, arousal or stress. So that's the two branches of the autonomic nervous system. And that's it. As far as the nervous system is concerned, that's it. Like, it's that simple. That's the breakdown. That's the simple breakdown. That's the Psych 101, Introduction to Psychology breakdown of the nervous system and the branches and the parts you need to know about. And the diagram that I put up and that you see there and the way I kind of try to elaborate on it should really give you a good understanding of what the parts are and how it's broken down. That's what you need to know as far as the nervous system. Now, as far as the nervous system is concerned, it's involved with bringing in and receiving information so your brain can process it, but also kicking out information so you can interact within the world. And once again, like I say, that's pretty cool and pretty interesting because nothing happens without the brain. The mind doesn't happen without the brain, behavior doesn't happen without the brain, so it's important for us to know about the brain and the nervous system if we want to understand anything else about human behavior. It all comes back to these systems and how they work with sensation and perception a little bit later on, next chapter in this book that I'm discussing. So that's really why I want to get you interested, one, in the brain and the nervous system, but two, simply break down the different branches of the nervous system so you can kind of have some ways to remember them particularly. All right, so that's the nervous system. That's roughly speaking how it works. You have the somatic branch that deals with afferent neurons and efferent neurons that receive information or carry information. We talked about that as far as that acronym SAME, afferent and efferent nerves or neurons. And then you have the autonomic, where you got the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branch, okay? So we understand what the different nervous systems in the body are, roughly speaking. Now the question is, how do they communicate? How does it all talk to each other? How does it happen? How in the hell does all those systems, how do they communicate with each other? And that's where we get into the discussion about neurons and the different nerve cells that are in charge of the messengers or the messages that are transmitted throughout the body, received and sent throughout the body, that make this system, one, so complex, but make it run the way that it does, which in turn results in the behavior that we exhibit. So let's talk about neurons specifically, those specific cells that I just mentioned earlier that are involved and that the nervous system is incorporated, it incorporates the nerve. Let's talk about those cells that the nervous system is incorporated of. I'm not sure if that's the way to say that or not, but I hope you know what I mean. The nervous system consists of a bunch of cells. Those cells are nerve cells. So as far as nerve cells are concerned, neurons. Neurons are what we're talking about. We have a lot of them. We already know we have over 100 billion neurons in our body. I won't get into the numbers, the specifics, and I also don't want to get into the breakdown of the physical structure of a neuron. I'll throw up a figure here. You can check it out. We can see. We know that there's some basic structures when it comes to the neuron. We know what the parts of it are. You got the dendrites, nucleus, axon, myelin sheath coats the axon, and then you have the receiving neuron. We know that neurons are broken down into specific parts. There's just a handful of parts to the neuron. You need to know those. They're relevant. But what I really want you to focus on and want you to understand is how they communicate and the synaptic transmission, what takes place and how these neurons talk to each other. That's what I'm going to focus on right now and try to help you understand and maybe hopefully simplify a little bit for you to understand that a little bit better. Because it's one thing to know what a nervous system is, another thing to know that we have neurons and know what a neuron is, but to understand the complexity of how these parts work together and how they transmit information that results in certain behaviors, certain emotions, that's a whole different story. So let's take a look at the neurons and specifically how the neurons interact with each other. And what that is called is the synaptic transmission. That's what I want to focus on right now. And synaptic transmission has to do with the synapse, okay? And the synaptic gap, which is where I say all the magic happens when it comes to neurons and neurotransmitters. So let's look at that synaptic gap and where all the magic happens right now. So looking at figure 5, we can see that this can get very complicated if we get caught up in all of the things that are going on and we don't know, one, what the parts are, and two, what we're looking at. So let's look at this and I'll try to elaborate a little bit on what we have here. So there's two areas that are zoomed in here. We zoom in from the terminal button. You see that zoom in of that little picture there on the left. They zoom in, they show you what that little terminal button looks like and how it's almost touching that other nerve there. But then they zoom in again to that little square, little circles there. And so you got a couple different images here. We'll focus on first, obviously, the two neurons. Know this about neurons. They don't touch. Neurons are not connected physically. They don't touch. They don't communicate via touch. So the way neurons communicate is not through touch, it's through chemical messages. So it's a chemical connection or a chemical communication. And what happens is there's a gap in between each of the neurons. If you can think of it like, you know, how railroad cars, they connect and there's actual physical connection, we'll take the railroad cars and just put a gap in between where they would latch on, and don't touch them together, and just leave a little bit of a space. I don't know if you can see that or not. That space in between there where those two railroad cars would connect, that space in between there, there's the same thing goes on between your neurons. There's a little space. That's called the synaptic gap. That's where all the magic happens. That's what I want you to focus on as far as the transmission that takes place and the role that neurotransmitters play, or I should say, the role that that gap plays when it comes to neurotransmitters. So the synaptic gap is very important. It's everything when it comes to how neurons communicate to each other, and if they do communicate. The neurotransmitters are very important as well, but just understand the area on the neurons that they don't touch, and that this synaptic gap is where all the magic happens, and a lot of things can take place in this gap, and I'll try to simplify a couple of the different things that can take place there and give you some real life examples so you can understand this, at least the relevance of it to your life and to our behavior. So looking again, once again at this figure, at figure 5, some of the terminology that we need to know is the synaptic transmission is what takes place. That's that transmission that takes place between neurons that happens in the synaptic gap, and the terminal buttons are those button-like looking thumb things at the end there of the axons that we have from one neuron going to the other. When we see the terminal button, it's labeled there. And then we have the receiving neuron. So the receiving neuron is relevant as well. And the receiving neuron receives the chemical message from the sending neuron, from the terminal button of the sending neuron. It receives the message on its dendrites. So what happens is one neuron has an axon. All neurons have axons. One neuron sending its chemical impulse, the electrochemical impulse, through the axon, out through the terminal button, to the receiving neuron. Now the receiving neuron is going to receive that message on their dendrite. So the dendrite are the small little fingers that receive. Terminal button at the end of the axon is where the message is sent. Just understand that marriage or that relationship there. Okay, so you should have a good understanding and a visual there of the synaptic gap and what's going on with the two neurons. Now let's get into the actual chemical message that's sent between one neuron and the other. And this happens like that, chain reaction all throughout the body. It's a chemical message. So what are they called, those chemical messengers? You already know what they're called. They're called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters, scientists have identified over 100 or so, and they're probably going to find even more. Now the book doesn't elaborate on, and I'm not going to elaborate on, clearly not going to elaborate on all 100. I'm not going to elaborate on much of them at all. There's 7 or 8 that I could mention that may be relevant to you, may be familiar with. I'll give you a couple of examples using neurotransmitters, but I'm not going to elaborate on what they all are. You may hear of them and I may mention their names, but understand the chemical messages, the chemical messengers that are sent from between neurons are called neurotransmitters, and they do exactly that. They transmit information from one neuron to the next throughout the body, throughout the nervous system. That's important for you to know. That is how nerves communicate, and that's how everything happens within the nervous system. So looking at, once again, at this figure, I'm gonna focus on letter C there. You see the little red circle with the letter C. I'm gonna focus on that image that's really, really ultra zoomed into what's going on there. So you see, it looks like these garbage bins, or I should say this opening where it's dumping these little red dots, red circles into this gap, okay? And then you have the green receptor bin. All that is very important, it's very relevant. Those red little round red balls, or whatever you wanna call them, red spheres, red circles, those are the neurotransmitters. So what will happen is when one neuron receives an impulse, it'll dump those neurotransmitters into the synaptic gap, and the receiving neuron will receive those that neurotransmitter with a specific receptor bin or receptor site. Now that receptor site is specific to that neurotransmitter. They're not generic. It's not like a trash can, you throw anything in it. That only fits that one specific neurotransmitter. So let's just put this to real use. So if that neurotransmitter being sent is dopamine, then dopamine's being sent from one neuron, it's being collected by the next neuron only in that one receptor bin labeled and specified for dopamine, okay? So they have specific receptor bins that they bind to, and that's where they fit, and that's the only place they fit. That's why a whole lot of things can happen in that gap. One, maybe you don't produce enough dopamine to bind to these receptors, so the chain reaction, if you will, it doesn't happen effectively. Maybe when you produce that dopamine, there's something called reuptake, which is where the dopamine or the neurotransmitter floats around in that synaptic gap. It can get reabsorbed into the neuron that was sending the message and get used again. So it's called the reuptake process. So that neurotransmitter can get reabsorbed, and if too much of it gets reabsorbed and not enough gets used, well, we have a problem, because now the message isn't being sent the way it needs to be sent, because we're not even binding to the receptors it should be bound to. Forgive me. So that's the process, and there's a lot more that can happen there, but that's just so that you know what goes on in that gap. And that image really kind of elaborates on that for the most part. You have those receptor bins, binding receptor with binding site. That's really what we're talking about as far as where these neurotransmitters go between neurons. Okay, so now that we understand a little bit about that gap and the chemical messengers that take place and go between one neuron and the next, and that takes place in that gap, let's look a little bit specifically at some examples of what can happen and what can go on with neurotransmitters inside of that gap. Here's a real key point with neurotransmitters. They can do one of two things as far as the message that they're relaying. They can be excitatory or inhibitory, meaning they can stimulate nerves to fire or they can prevent them from firing, roughly speaking. Some neurotransmitters have an aspect to them where they're both actually inhibitory and excitatory. This is where it could be complicated. But just understand there are really two main functions of what these messages are trying to do, or messengers are trying to do, which is either excitatory or inhibitory. Stimulate or stop for the most part. Drugs are very important, and we need to talk about drugs as far as the relationship between your biochemistry and your behavior and how they work. Well, drugs work, generally speaking, drugs work by playing off of these neurotransmitters, and they do one of two things. Drugs do when it comes to this biochemistry that you naturally have going on in your body. What drugs do is they either mimic or act like a neurotransmitter that you already produce. That would be called an agonist. Or a drug that you take can be an antagonist, and it can prevent or stop the production or the use or the absorption of a neurotransmitter. So drugs can do, and not all drugs are bad, but they're powerful because this is exactly what they do. They can interfere with or compensate for or affect and impact your biochemistry by literally masking and looking like something you already produce, and your body doesn't know the difference between a drug and a neurotransmitter. Or they can prevent your body from using what it naturally produces. So drugs are powerful for that reason. So when it comes to drugs and neurotransmitters, understand the relationship there, or the terms you need to know there are agonists and antagonists. Agonists are drugs that act like a neurotransmitter that you naturally produce, and antagonists are drugs that prevent or stop the effects of a neurotransmitter that you produce. How about some real life examples? So an agonist. What's an agonist? Cocaine is a drug, in case you didn't know. But in terms of what we're talking about today, what kind of drug is cocaine? I should say, is it an agonist or an antagonist? Cocaine is an agonist. Cocaine binds to the receptor sites or the bins of dopamine in your body. So your body naturally produces dopamine, you receive dopamine, you have a certain feeling, it's function. It serves a certain role and it plays a certain function in your body. We need it. It naturally happens. When you take cocaine, cocaine binds to those receptors, so your body thinks it's dopamine and reacts accordingly. And cocaine also stimulates and increases the production, the natural production of dopamine in your body. So it's twofold, but it's an agonist. It's acting like and speeding up the production, increasing production of dopamine in your body. So we know cocaine is an agonist in your body, and it binds to those same receptor sites as this neurotransmitter dopamine. So that's an agonist. What's another agonist? Adderall is an agonist, believe it or not. And what's interesting with Adderall is oftentimes you take Adderall for ADHD and hyperattention, or I should say lack of attention, hyperactivity, and lack of attention. And so really what a lot of these drugs are they're actually speed. And you think, well, if I'm already hyperactive and I can't concentrate, why would I take something that really would stimulate me and speed me up? Why would I take speed? And speed would be an agonist. It would stimulate the production of certain neurotransmitters that cause you to cause arousals, to put it simply. But Adderall is an agonist that binds to it's very complicated actually, and it's worth looking up and looking into and Googling how does Adderall work in the body, and you'll see that it's actually an amphetamine, and the structure and the molecules of Adderall resemble MDMA and methamphetamines. And so if you want to know how powerful Adderall is and how it impacts the body and can affect the body, just look at the drugs that it's compared to structurally. MDMA, which is obviously active ingredient in ecstasy, or I should say the specific drug that we find in ecstasy, and then methamphetamines. So very powerful stuff there, and you can look into how that works, but it's an agonist. It acts like norepinephrine in the body, epinephrine in the body, and I believe it's dopamine also as well. It binds to those receptors and it increases the production of that neurotransmitter and mimics the functions of that neurotransmitter. So Adderall is an agonist as well, And there's actually a host of side effects that can come from that, and they're kind of schizophrenic-like symptoms is what I understood. There were some of the side effects were, because if you think about it, if you overdose on methamphetamines or you get addicted to them, and so what that can do to the body is very damaging. So just understand, and that's not everybody who takes Adderall, but understand how it works in your body, what it does to your body, and how it plays with your biochemistry. And then from there, obviously consult your doctor and take these drugs accordingly. But just so that you know, Adderall is an agonist as well. So those are agonists: cocaine, agonist; Adderall, agonist. They act like or increase the production of certain neurotransmitters in your body. What's an antagonist? Well, an antagonist is a drug that you would take that would either stop the production of a neurotransmitter, it would stop the production, or it would bind to the receptors and not let the neurotransmitter do its job. So if you think of a receptor bin or a receptor site for a neurotransmitter as like a garbage bin that only can fit the one neurotransmitter, an antagonist would fit into that garbage bin so that the neurotransmitter couldn't do its job. So it would kind of put a block on it, put a lid on that binding site, so now it can't receive that information. So what's an example of an antagonist? What's a drug that's an example of an antagonist? Well, here's a drug that none of you guys have ever heard of before: caffeine. Caffeine is an antagonist. How is caffeine an antagonist? Meaning, how does it affect the body and the neurotransmitters in the body? Well, you probably never have heard of the neurotransmitter that's related to caffeine, the drug. Adenosine is the neurotransmitter. So you naturally produce a neurotransmitter called adenosine, and adenosine has a couple different functions, but mainly with sleep cycle and wakefulness and alertfulness, that sort of thing. You produce adenosine, and adenosine can cause you to kind of be drowsy at times, but then be alert at others. It has a natural function in your body. Well, when you take caffeine, caffeine does two things. Caffeine blocks the effects of adenosine, so it finds those receptor bins, puts a lid on them, and adenosine can't do its job anymore. So adenosine can't work to make you drowsy, which is why you don't get drowsy when you're geeked up on caffeine. So adenosine 1 blocks the effects of, caffeine blocks the effects of adenosine naturally in the body for a certain period of time, for an extended period of time, a certain period of time. That's 1. And then 2, it also stimulates the adrenal glands, caffeine does. So what it does is it stimulates the adrenal glands and it blocks the receptor bins for the adenosine. Why does that matter? Well, because while you take that drug and those receptor bins are blocked, adenosine can't do its job. You're feeling the effects of the caffeine, the drug that the antagonist that now has entered your body. But that doesn't last forever, does it? No, it fades away, it goes away, and once it fades away and that lid comes off and that receptor site is wide open, and adenosine has been being produced, but it couldn't get in. When the lid comes off and adenosine's floating around, boop, they go right into that gap, and how do you feel? Sluggish, drowsy, lethargic. You crash off your caffeine. And what do you usually do? Go to sleep or go get more caffeine and rinse and repeat. Then you're addicted and you have bigger problems down the road. But anyway, that's how that works, and that's why we feel the way we do when the caffeine wears off. It's because the adenosine now can work and can do its job. There are other antagonists out there, but just so you know, when it comes to drugs and neurotransmitters, the way they work usually, really, for the most part, all drugs that generally drugs, there's maybe a few exceptions, but they work with how they play off of neurotransmitters as an agonist or an antagonist. So I wanted to make sure I point out those two key terms in the relationship to neurotransmitters. So just to recap, we talked about the nervous system, the different branches of the nervous system, different nerves, the roles that they play, different types of nerves that we have, neurons, what they are, how they function in the body, and the chemical messengers that are used to relay information throughout this system using neurons called neurotransmitters, and two specific types of drugs that can affect neurotransmitters, agonists and antagonists. That's the recap, that's the summarization. I hope that this really was helpful for you to understand the nervous system and make it be a little less overwhelming, because I know it can be very technical. And like I said, a lot of us aren't really interested in the body or the brain when we're interested in psychology, but they are really the same thing. You need to understand them both. So I hope this was helpful for you. Let me know, leave me a comment, let me know what was really helpful and maybe what you want to hear more about down in the comments below. If it was helpful and you find this interesting and you're looking forward to more lessons such as this in the area of psychology, please, I'd love it if you subscribe. Definitely get more information like that out to you guys. And until the next episode or the next lesson, take care.